Record 279. Patient, Catrina Bellamy. Admission, February 12, 1935. Age 30 years. Initial diagnosis, conversion disorder with unexplained physical symptoms. History. Catrina was referred to the asylum after suddenly losing the ability to walk, despite no evident physical issue. She believes her paralysis is a curse cast by something that dwells in the corridors of the asylum. Frequently, Catrina reports seeing crawling shadows around her bed at night. Additional notes. During episodes, mysterious bruises appear on her body, forming patterns resembling unknown runes. Catrina Bellamy arrived at Blackwood Asylum on a heavy, overcast day, as if the world already sensed the fate awaiting her. The vehicle that brought her barely stopped before she was hurriedly wheeled out, her wheelchair creaking over the gravel leading to the main entrance. She did not look back. Not because she didn't want to, but because something within her told her it was futile. The asylum was not a place of return. It was a threshold between what is known and what should remain hidden. The double doors of the building swung open, and the smell of old, moldy air hit Catrina like a slap. The sensation was suffocating, as if the very air was saturated with stories that no one should tell. The corridor was narrow, the walls stained by years of dampness and neglect, but what struck her most was the silence. It was not a natural silence, but something that seemed forced, as though sounds had been violently ripped from that place. The clinical record began almost mechanically. Patient 279. Name Catrina Bellamy. Age 30 years. Initial diagnosis, conversion disorder. Functional paralysis of the lower limbs, with no evident physical cause. Patient reports that her paralysis was caused by a curse. These dry words did not do justice to the woman occupying that wheelchair. Her fixed yet restless eyes scanned every corner of the place, as if expecting to find something or someone lurking. During the initial examination, Catrina was described as cooperative but disturbed. Her skin felt abnormally cold to the touch, although no physical anomalies had been identified. Normal reflexes, stable circulation, but the lower limbs remained motionless. When questioned, she replied with an unsettling calm, "I haven't lost my legs. They took that from me." This was the first mention of the crawling shadows in the medical record, although the doctors had not documented it exactly in that manner. To them, it was delirium, manifestations of a mind that could not bear the weight of its own reality. But to Catrina, they were as real as the cold ground beneath her motionless feet. They come at night. They crawl up the walls, down from the ceiling. And now they are inside me. Catrina's first night in the asylum was marked by an even more oppressive silence. She was placed in a small room with a single window overlooking an empty courtyard. The ceiling lamp flickered slightly, casting shadows on the walls that seemed to move of their own accord. When the footsteps of the nurses faded away in the corridor, she was finally alone. But the solitude was brief. That night, a nurse reported hearing murmurs coming from her room. Upon entering, he found her lying completely still, with her eyes open and fixed on the ceiling. Her lips moved almost imperceptibly, but no words came out. The medical record describes the incident as a temporary catatonia episode, but the nurse wrote something more in his personal notes. The room's temperature seemed to have dropped. When I entered, I felt as if I was being watched. The next morning, bruises had appeared on Catrina's legs. They were not mere pressure marks, but formed vaguely circular patterns, almost symmetrical, that appeared to have been made with unnatural precision. When asked, she replied, "These are their marks. They leave this to remind me." The doctors recorded the bruises as a result of unconscious movement during the night, but the truth was that no one knew what had caused them. For Catrina, there was no doubt. The asylum was not a refuge. It was an extension of the forces that pursued her. And the shadows which once inhabited the corners of her eyes now seemed closer. The medical record concluded the first entry with a dry clinical note. Patient exhibits signs of persecutory delusion, associated with conversion disorder. Paralysis remains unchanged. But for Catrina, there was nothing delusional about her experience. At that moment, as the rising sun barely illuminated the corridors, she knew that the asylum would not protect her from what was coming after her. In fact, it might be the epicenter of it all. The truth you are about to discover should not be understood. It must not be revealed. Yet still she waits, hidden in the shadows of Asylum Blackwood. What happened there can never be explained, but the line between reality and delusion fades with each new revelation. Sign up now and prepare to enter where silence is the only thing that remains, where nothing is as it seems. The shadows were no longer mere peripheral presences for Catrina. They had grown, expanding their influence, until they occupied the center of her existence in the asylum. On the second day of her internment, she began to describe more precisely what she saw, or perhaps what she believed she was seeing. The shadows were not mere blurs or stains in the darkness. They had form and movement. They glided along the walls like liquid creatures, yet with a consistency that defied logic. In her accounts, they were denser where the light was weakest, but even under the flickering lamp in her room, they seemed to exist on a plane that transcended the visible. The medical records began to meticulously document her nights. The pattern of the bruises that appeared on her legs became more complex. Lines that had once seemed chaotic now appeared to organize themselves into geometric shapes, as if something were trying to communicate a message in a forgotten language. The attending physician, however, saw no meaning in it. To him, they were merely signs of unconscious self-harm, a reflection of her disturbed mind. But Catrina disagreed. "They are leaving their mark," she repeated, her voice laden with a conviction that made the nurses hesitate before dismissing her words as delusions. Catrina began to question her own sanity. During the nights when she managed to keep her eyes open, she watched the shadows dancing around her, creating shapes that seemed to suggest intentions. There were moments when she felt as if they were watching her back, their movements pausing, like predators calculating the right moment to strike. However, in the rare moments when sleep overcame her, she awoke with fragments of dreams that were not hers, disjointed images of endless corridors, doors that never led to the same place, and whispers in a language that burned her mind as she tried to comprehend it. The cold in her room became a constant. No matter how many blankets were used to cover her, the temperature around Catrina always seemed to be several degrees lower than the rest of the building. The nurses began to notice this, although they never mentioned it directly. The medical record, however, ignored these anomalies, focusing on the more tangible symptoms. Patient reports an increase in the intensity of visual hallucinations. Reports include detailed descriptions of dark shapes in motion. Bruises continue to appear in unnatural patterns, but with no physical explanation. Catrina was trapped in an internal conflict. Part of her wanted to believe that everything was a product of her mind, a construction of her broken psyche, a way of coping with the inexplicable paralysis. But there was another part, deeper and more instinctive, that knew this was real. The shadows were not just around her. They were inside the asylum, and perhaps they were inside her. This thought grew like an infestation, contaminating her perception and making it impossible to distinguish reality from delusion. That week, the head doctor of her ward, Dr. Victor Halstead, decided to intervene more incisively. He was a methodical, cold, and incredibly skeptical man. To Halstead, everything in the world could be explained by science, and Catrina was no exception. He initiated a series of intensive sessions with her, recording every reaction, every word, with the precision of a surgeon. The medical record reflects his methodical approach. Patients subjected to experimental hypnosis sessions to explore the psychological origin of the paralysis. Ambiguous responses. Patient reports an increase in visions after each session. For Catrina, the sessions with Halstead were torturous. Hypnosis seemed to open something inside her, a portal that brought the shadows even closer. With each session, her paralysis seemed to weigh more heavily, as if something were anchoring itself in her body. The shadows were not just watching. Now they seemed to react to what was happening inside the treatment room. After one of the sessions, she said, "You are messing with what you don't understand. They don't like this." Halstead ignored her, interpreting the statement as psychological resistance. But the bruises on her legs began to spread to her arms, and the geometric shapes became more intricate. The climax came during a session of electroshock therapy, a controversial method that Halstead believed to be effective in redefining the patient's brain circuits. The medical record notes the session as successful, with no physical complications. But the truth was different. During the electrical impulses, Catrina did not scream. She laughed. Not a human laugh, but something that sounded like an echo coming from a very distant place. Halstead described the moment as an involuntary reflex. But the nurses present never entered her room alone again. After each treatment, the shadows seemed to take shape. Catrina began to see them during the day, reflected in the window panes or lurking in the corners where the light did not reach. Even more disturbing, she started to feel that the shadows were not merely observing, they were communicating. What they said, however, was something her mind could not comprehend, but her body reacted. The cold around her intensified, and even Halstead began to notice the change in the temperature of the room during their sessions. Catrina started to realize that the shadows were not separate entities. They were part of the asylum itself, as if the horrors that had occurred in that place had come to life. But there was something more. Something that went beyond the walls in time. Something that was growing. She didn't know if Halstead was trying to save her or awaken her to something far worse. The medical record continued to document her experiences, but for Catrina, those cold words meant nothing. The truth lay in the corners of the room, in the murmurs that only she could hear, and in the shapes that moved where the light never touched. The nights in Blackwood Asylum were a black ocean, where Catrina's mind repeatedly sank. The cold in her room had become unbearable, a palpable presence that seemed to seep through every pore of her skin. The shadows no longer confined themselves to the walls or corners. They now surrounded her in a living circle, their pulsating movements like an evil heart, beating in a rhythm that echoed in her head. It was during one of those nights that reality began to dissolve. Catrina awoke, or perhaps she had never slept. Her mind was trapped on a threshold between consciousness and nightmare, and it was in this state that she saw something she had never noticed before. The walls around her were not just old and stained. They had marks, inscriptions, lines that coiled like dry roots, connecting to one another in a pattern that seemed alive. She ran her fingers over one of these marks, feeling its rough and cold texture, and as she did, a searing heat coursed through her body, as if the runes etched into the wall were the echo of something buried in her flesh. She didn't know how she ended up in the basement. Perhaps she had been taken by the shadows, or perhaps she had walked, her legs, for a moment, responding to a force that was not her own. The corridor beneath the asylum had no light, only an oppressive darkness that seemed to devour every sound. The floor was covered in dampness, and the smell of oxidized iron filled the air, as if the very bones of the place were rotting. In one corner she found a pile of papers, yellowed and faded, scattered beside a table that looked as if it had been abandoned for decades. The words were almost illegible, but the drawings were clear. Twisted human forms surrounded by circles of runes similar to the marks on her skin. On a more intact page, she saw something that made her heart stop for a moment. An anatomical diagram of a human body, marked with the same patterns that now spread across her legs and arms. Each line was a grotesque echo of the bruises appearing on her flesh. The text accompanying the drawings was disturbing. The names in the annotations were crossed out, replaced by numbers. Subject 14. Marks appear spontaneously after prolonged exposure to the core. Patterns indicate attempts at communication by entities. Uncertain progress. The words prolonged exposure seemed to scream at her, resonating in her mind like a muffled cry. She was not the first. Something had been done before her, repeated like a profane melody that never ended. Catrina felt a warm dampness trickle down the side of her head. As she touched the spot, she realized she was bleeding. The blood was not just red. It seemed diluted, thinner, as if something was draining it. Looking at the floor, she saw that it did not pool as it should have. Instead, it appeared to be absorbed by the cracks in the concrete, moving in lines that followed the same pattern as the runes on the walls. When she tried to flee, the shadows responded. They did not just encircle her, they held her. An invisible weight fell upon her shoulders, forcing her to kneel on the cold ground. She saw something emerge from the darkness, a shape that seemed devoid of substance but laden with intent. The thing leaned over her with no eyes, no face, but with a presence that felt like it was burning her skin. It was then that she saw, or felt, something that the human mind should not endure. A web of connections, an endless cycle of suffering and experiments, all centered in that place. The asylum was not just a building. It was a living entity feeding on its victims, extending its invisible tentacles beyond time and space. When it awakened, it was back in its room. The medical report described the event as an episode of dissociation, accompanied by a new series of bruises now spreading across the torso. The medical team noted that the patterns were becoming more detailed, forming something resembling a map, but no one could say what it represented. The doctors attempted to explain the bleeding as a consequence of her mental health, but no one could answer why the floor of her room was stained with symbols similar to those found in the ancient pages that were now missing. Catrina knew she was not delusional. She felt the pattern growing inside her, not just on her skin, but in her bones, in her mind. It was as if something was being written into her existence, transforming her into a living book for something she could not comprehend. "I am part of this now," she murmured to herself, as the cold around her intensified, and the shadows began to move again. However, the most terrifying realization came the following night. Observing her reflection in the window glass, she realized she was no longer merely a spectator of the shadows. They were inside her, moving beneath her skin like writhing worms, projecting patterns that were impossible to ignore. She did not know if she was becoming part of the asylum or if the asylum was becoming part of her, but there was one thing she was certain of. Any line between the real and the imaginary had been completely obliterated. The darkness that night did not seem natural. It was thick, almost tangible, like a heavy veil suffocating the air in Catrina's room. The lamp on the ceiling swayed slightly, casting shadows that seemed to move independently, like creatures lurking at the edge of her vision. She was sitting on her bed, motionless, her eyes fixed on the door, but the door no longer seemed a reliable barrier. Something was out there, she knew. Something that had patiently awaited that night. The cold that permeated the room seemed to come from within her, radiating from her own skin. Each breath was difficult, the air too dense to be inhaled easily. Her ears picked up sounds that did not belong to that place. Fragmented whispers in a language that did not exist, creaks of wood echoing like breaking bones, and a constant scratching that seemed to come from the walls. No, not just from the walls, from the very fabric of reality itself. The shadows began to move in a more deliberate manner. They were no longer diffuse smudges at the periphery. They had taken shape, a physical presence that made the room feel smaller, constricted. They slid across the floor like liquid, but there was something solid in their essence. When the first shadow approached her bed, Catrina felt the skin on her arms prickling, and a sharp pain shot through her legs, as if something were trying to break through the barriers of her flesh. She tried to scream, but her voice did not come out. Her throat felt sealed, as if the shadows themselves had stolen her ability to express herself. All that remained was the sound of her short, rapid breathing, and the thumping of her own heart, beating so loudly it seemed to echo throughout the room. The bruises on her skin began to burn, each mark glowing like extinguished embers, forming patterns that seemed to align with the shapes the shadows were assuming. The clock in the corner of the room struck midnight, but the hands no longer moved. Time had either stopped or folded in on itself. Catrina realized she was alone in a space that no longer belonged to the real world. The shadows were now approaching, taking on vaguely human forms. There were faces among them, or at least something resembling eyes and mouths, but they were distorted things, grotesque parodies of the human. They did not speak, but their presences emitted a low-frequency sound that resonated directly in her mind, as if each shadow were implanting an idea, a command, a lost story. One of them climbed onto her bed, moving with the grace of a calculated predator. Catrina could not move. Her legs remained inert, heavy as lead, while the rest of her body trembled. The shadow leaned over her, its face mere inches from hers, but there was no warmth, only absolute cold. The contact was indescribable. It was not physical, but something that penetrated her mind. It was as if her memories were being torn away, reviewed, and replaced by fragments of something that did not belong to this world. She closed her eyes, but it brought no relief. Inside her head, she saw images she did not understand. A black tree growing in a field of flesh, an infinite tower made of bones, where screams echoed like chants, and asylum itself, but in a form that was not of this time. It seemed alive, pulsating, its walls moving like the ribs of a giant animal. When she opened her eyes again, all the shadows were around her, circling her in a hypnotic movement, forming a whirlpool of darkness that seemed to grow and spin upon itself. Catrina tried to scream again, but the sound that came out was not hers. It was something monstrous, something that should not exist. The room seemed to be crumbling around her, the walls dissolving into nothing, leaving her in an absolute void, with only the shadows for company. She felt her body fragment, not physically but on a deeper level, as if her identity were being torn apart and scattered through space. Somewhere distant, or perhaps within herself, she heard voices, a cacophony of screams, murmurs, and laughter. The shadows began to merge, their human forms disappearing, becoming something greater, a single colossal entity that stared at her with eyes that did not exist. For a moment, Catrina felt something she had never felt before. It was not fear, it was not pain. It was like an absolute void, the certainty that she was no more. Her mind, her body, her soul, everything was being absorbed by the darkness, and for the first time, she realized that perhaps this was what the shadows had wanted all along. Not to kill her, but to make her part of themselves. What happened next remains a mystery. The report only states that Catrina was found the next morning, curled up in the corner of her room, her eyes empty, her skin marked with patterns even more complex that seemed to pulse slightly. The nurses reported that the temperature in the room was unbearably low, and the clock still showed midnight, as if time had stopped forever that night. Catrina did not speak of what had happened, but she did not need to. Her presence was different now, as if something had been left behind, or something completely new had taken its place. She had faced the shadows, but she had not won. They had taken her, and all that remained was the echo of who she had once been. On the night that would mark the pinnacle of her stay at Asylum Blackwood, something broke into the reality surrounding Catrina Bellamy. The records described the moment as an acute crisis, but those who were present knew there were no words to capture what truly occurred. She was found in her bed, contorting in impossible ways, as if her body were being manipulated by invisible forces. Her murmurs, so low they could barely be heard, echoed with a weight that seemed to distort the very air around her. The nurses hesitated, fearing to approach. The room had transformed. The walls vibrated slightly, small cracks appearing in their corners, while the temperature plummeted to icy levels. The shadows, so familiar to those corridors, were no longer confined to the corners. They moved freely, forming patterns around Catrina, almost as if dancing in response to the incomprehensible words she uttered. In the most intense moment, Catrina arched her body backward, her eyes fixed on something no one else could see, as if contemplating a window to another world. The glow in the bruises on her skin became pulsating, aligning with the rhythm of her murmurs, until everything culminated in a single, abrupt scream that seemed to be wrenched from the very core of the universe. Then silence. When dawn arrived, the team found Catrina sitting on the edge of the bed. Her eyes were open, but there was no recognition in them. She appeared empty, yet at the same time, something in the depths of her gaze indicated that she saw more than anyone could imagine. Slowly she stood up, surprising everyone present. It was the first time she had walked since her admission. Her movements were fluid, yet carried an unsettling strangeness, as if she were imitating what a human body should do, rather than simply being herself. That morning she did not speak. She did not react to the questions. She merely drew, filling pages with symbols so intricate they defied any interpretation. The doctors noted that the patterns were almost hypnotic, each line seeming to conceal something greater, a logic that eluded understanding. For 2 more nights, Catrina remained in the asylum, but her behavior did not change. She walked through the corridors like a shadow, passing by other patients and staff without even looking at them. Her presence seemed to absorb the energy of the places she passed through, leaving the environments colder, quieter. The doctors, seeing no further clinical reason to keep her hospitalized, decided to discharge her. The decision was surrounded by discomfort, as if everyone knew they were making a mistake, yet no one dared to admit it. On the morning of her departure, Catrina was taken to the gate. The medical record notes that at the moment the gate was unlocked, she stopped, looked back, and finally spoke, for the first time since that night. There was no longer a trace of her former paralysis. Her steps, once impossible, were now steady, but disconcertingly mechanical, as if she were following a silent, unknown command. She did not look back. She did not glance at anyone. She simply walked slowly, crossing the line between the asylum and the mist that was forming at dawn. The nurses accompanying her, stunned, dared not say a word. It was as if words no longer served any purpose. She had exited, but the asylum seemed to have marked her in a way that no one could comprehend. And then, at the moment she was about to disappear into the fog, Catrina stopped. She stood there, motionless, without looking back, but with something in her eyes, something that defied explanation. Then she said, her voice calm, devoid of emotion, "I have returned, but it was not I who came back." With those words, she continued to walk, without even hesitating. The gate closed silently, and Catrina vanished into the mist that began to engulf the landscape. The asylum remained silent for hours, as if the very building was processing what had just happened. The doctors were perplexed. The final record was completed without ceremony, but an unsettling note was attached. Patient discharged. Complete and inexplicable physical recovery. Mental condition uncertain. Something was left behind. What remained was not who entered. That night, the Blackwood Asylum seemed emptier than ever, yet the sound of hollow footsteps echoed in the corridors, as if someone or something was still there. Something lives in the shadows of the Blackwood Asylum. Something that watches, waits, and hides in every corner. You feel it, don't you? Those who enter rarely return intact. But you are about to cross the line. There is no turning back. The truth, or what remains of it, is waiting. Sign up now, not only to discover what happened, but to become part of what is to come.